In the next 15 minutes, Claudia and I would like to share with you the process that we went through in renovating the Cianci House here at 2607 Nelson in Upper Dunderave. And we also want to share some of the history of the house and the neighbourhood, and through all of this, talk a little bit about some of the features that define the character of the area. Claudia and I were looking in the early 2000s for a family home that would also house Claudia's mother, and we were looking for a place that was close to school, close to shops and public transit, and ideally with a view. We were attracted to the Upper Dunderave neighbourhood, and in behind trees and hedges, this is the property we saw at 2607 Nelson, just 2 houses in from the ridge of 26th Street. As you can see, when you get inside the hedge, it's a fairly striking house from the outside, and on the inside, this is the Inglenook fireplace in the main room, and there were a lot of original features still in place in the house. Copper lighting, some woodwork features, and the old beaten door furniture. There were actually plenty of reasons not to buy it. We were about the 20th party to view this property, and just about everybody we talked to told us how much work there was involved in it. The stone foundations had settled, there was old wiring and old plumbing, and the roof was 70 years old and in need of replacing. There had been a 1954 edition, which was really in pretty bad shape. And then, as if all that weren't enough, there were four-legged residents. And here's one of the squirrels, which was resident in one of the gables. But on the other hand, there was no question that for us the house had a presence, and it did actually have a view from Mount Baker in the east all the way around to Lighthouse Park in the west. The neighbours were very welcoming, and as I touched on, we really enjoyed the neighbourhood character. Just about everybody that we talked to really couldn't conceive of bulldozing such a house with its stone foundation and wood paneling throughout. And we looked at the option of renovating the main house and doing something to the addition, and at the same time adding an in-law suite. We didn't really consider the option of renovating the main house and adding a laneway house, or even going down the road of a heritage revitalization agreement, because the options of a laneway house and an HRA nearly 20 years ago here in West Vancouver weren't really very mature. We assembled our team, Bud Wood and Sandra Moore from Birmingham and Wood Architects. You may know some of their public work, the graduate residences, dining hall and common rooms of UBC's Green College. It was some of their earlier work. More recently, Celebration Hall and the administration building and landscaping in the Mountain View Cemetery. Don Luxton gave us heritage advice. I think he's well known to many of you. George Christopher had the unenviable job of converting the concepts and the plans into construction, and he was assisted by Carlos Chiu and Judith Reeve with landscape design. Our approach was staged. Our initial thought was to replace the old addition and replace it with new dining room and kitchen, and then over the top of that to add a second store in-law suite for Claudia's mother. Now, I will say at the time we were doing this, the District of West Vancouver only allowed in-law suites on the main floor or a basement level because of the perception of egress for an elderly person. What Bud and Sandra conceived was that if the laneway were the actual point of access, then you could have a level suite from the garage and a walkway all the way over the top of the house that would provide one-level living for an older person, but also provide light and views. We decided to defer much of the work on the main house, but recognized we needed to replace the roof and the heating system. And since we were going to be doing the roof and the guttering, we decided to add some rainwater cisterns as well. This is the building as it unfolded. George was really given a very narrow building space down one side of the property between the main house and the neighbour's lot and trees. And our neighbour was very keen to preserve the trees, and George managed to do that. Every one of the trees along the property line survived. You can see on the right-hand panel, looking from the back laneway over the top of the storage room for the garage, then right forward to the new addition, which would give us a kitchen and dining room. And then over the top of this was going to be a walkway and the in-law suite. Here's George installing one of actually two cisterns, each of 5,000 litres. So we do have a little bit of sprinkling water for the garden when things get dry. And this, after the 2 years of the construction and renovation process, this is what the house looked like from the outside. In the top left, you can see that the main part of the house viewed from the road and the west side is pretty much unchanged. The addition, which is on the east, was pulled back from the main house so that it's not readily visible. As you see in this top panel here behind the pole, the addition is just visible in here. When you go around to the back of the house, here's the garage with a storage room and the cistern underneath it, and the walkway, which then leads over the top of the new addition and into the in-law suite. When you look at it from the inside, on the right-hand panel, this is what this really quite small 400 square foot suite looks like on the inside, but it has a much larger feel to it because Bud and Sandra conceived of informing that new work with the vaulted concept of the main room of the main house. And you can see the exposed woodwork and roof struts that give it that sense of space. And along the way, we learned a huge amount about the original house and how it was constructed. We learned about the former owners and their families, and we certainly learned a lot about the neighbourhood that we were now residents of. The subdivision was laid out in 1912. It was laid out in a grid pattern, and originally in this Upper Dunderave area, the names of all the east-west streets were British prime ministers. So Nelson at the time was Asquith. They were all changed at a later stage so that there was an alphabetical alignment of the names. You can see here that 26th Street was called 26th Road North, and that's important because that was actually right on the spur leading down from Hollyburn Mountain down to the waterfront. That spur actually was known on some of the early maps as Dogwood Hill. As you've heard from Jackie, that was pretty much the axis for people coming from the city for walking opportunities on Hollyburn to access the cabin area and the lakes and to access the skiing. On the other hand, people would go up there and they would come down packing out cedar blocks, which were then used for roof shakes both here on the North Shore, but also over in the city. And it's interesting talking to some of the postal people, and they've been very clear that this area that they refer to as the hump has never been the first choice for them because it's been too steep and the garden paths have been too long. The house was built in 1931 when the only access was by the ferry. The architect was a German, Hans Karl Bechten-Breiter, and Don Luxton has described the style of the house as a lodge style. He tells us that the only thing in the local vernacular that even compares with it is Minnekata Lodge out near the Pitt River, although he does liken it to some of the parkitecture that is a term used for the lodges in the national parks in the United States. The building pad was excavated with a horse-drawn bucket scraper, and the rock for this 12-foot high rubble foundation was split on site, and we're told that the timber was milled on site as well. This is what the house looked like at the end of construction, looking from the northwest down toward the street. And you can see the very extensive foundation that comes right up to the level of the windowsills, and then the wooden superstructure on top of that. The house was built by Bechten-Breiter for Sybil Hill and Vito Cianci, and they owned the house through till about 1945. They had met at the Vancouver School of Decorative and Applied Art. They'd both been taught by Fred Varley and Fred Amos, and particularly Vito had been influenced by the photographer John Vanderpant. Sybil exhibited her paintings both in BC and in Seattle, and her studio was actually the mezzanine in the main room, looking out over the water. The paint is still on the wooden floor up there, and Claudia and I continue to debate whether we leave it under the carpet or whether we should refinish the floor. Vito was a painter, but he took up photography and built himself a darkroom. And you can see in this image of the dogwoods in the area very much the influence of Vanderpant with the image using light and shade. Michaela, who known as Mike, and Donato were their two boys who grew up here, and they attended Pauline Johnson School. Irwin Park had not been built back in the 30s. And this is an image from on the front steps of Irwin Park from, we think, the early 40s. I hope if anybody can identify what this pageant was or exactly when, that they might be able to share it with us. But in the back row, Mike and Donato, and then the red arrow that I hope you can see is pointing to this Japanese boy whose name was Aki. And Aki Hoshino was one of two families who lived right next door to the Ciancis in a house. And Aki was Donato's friend after school. Donato has lots of stories about them playing together, but he also vividly remembers how he went over to the Hoshino household one Saturday morning to find Aki, only to see the house completely empty and the door banging in the breeze. And the family had been taken down to Hastings Park and then from there sent to an internment camp in Lemon Creek. I guess one had rather wished that Donato and Aki could meet up, but by the time we finally tracked Aki down, both he and his partner had passed away. That being said, we have from that neighbouring property over the years found quite a number of artefacts which speak to the presence of the Japanese family and their vegetable garden and their fruit trees. And here are just some of the fragments of pottery and glassware that we've collected. There's no question that the neighbourhood here in Upper Dunderave has evolved from 1930s when the house was built through to 2020 now. There have been about 3 cycles of families and their children. Back in the 1930s, the area was very cosmopolitan. There were Caucasians, certainly, but there were immigrants. I've talked to you about some of the Japanese families. There were also artists here, quite a community of artists, both behind and in front of the Ciancis. And when we moved into the neighborhood in 2001, our neighbor was Ian Rolls, whose sculpture will be well known to some of you. He has now passed on, but the legacy of artists is now, that mantle is now worn by Sue Daniel down on Mathers, just in front of us. Despite the way the neighborhood has evolved, these threads have been common, but also the character of the neighborhood has stayed pretty much as it has been over many years. Yes, some of the houses are bigger, some of the trees have come down, but it is still a very green neighborhood with a semi-rural feel. You can see the greenery spilling right down to the road edge. There's a lot of use of stone and wood, high-pitched roofs. And if you are here at nighttime, it has a very dark, unlit ambience to it, which I think is valued by many people. So in conclusion, Claudia and I have tried to share with you how the renovation and adding of an in-law suite was an approach that worked for our 3 generations. We've enjoyed learning about the former owners in the neighborhood. We hope we have retained the house and the retained house and the streetscape have contributed to the character of the area. And all of that being said, there's still no question that we have more work to do on the house, and we hope along the way we will hear more stories about the neighborhood. Thank you very much.